In the autumn of 1974, on a stretch of low, wet ground in the Awhol Hills of Clackmannanshire, a man named Hugh Brodie stood at the edge of a black peat bog with his daughter beside him and told her the truth as he understood it. The ground under their boots was worth nothing. It grew no barley worth the harvest. It carried no sheep without rotting their feet. It drank a tractor to the axle if you were fool enough to drive one onto it. And it had done all of this for as long as the family had held the deed. He called it the dead acre. He told her to leave it be and put her hopes on the dry fields above it, where a crop could at least be counted. She was 9 years old, and she believed him because he was her father, and because he was right about almost everything. 41 years later, in the spring of 2015, a buyer from a spirits house in Edinburgh sat across a plank table from that same daughter, then 50 years old, and read a single figure off a sheet of paper. The figure was for 1 cask of whiskey, a single oak barrel, and it was more than her father had earned from the whole farm in the best year of his life. The bog he had called the dead acre had made it. Let me tell you about the years between those 2 days, because they hold a lesson about what a place is worth and who gets to decide it. Her name was Catherine Brodie, and the people in the glen knew her for 2 things. They knew she could read weather off the hills better than the radio could, and they knew she did not waste words explaining herself. She had grown up on the farm at Tullibody Mains, 420 acres of mixed ground that ran from good arable at the top to the sodden, useless bottom her father despised. He farmed it the way his father had, barley and oats and a small flock, and he kept the books in a hand so careful that every shilling could be traced. Catherine learned all of it. She also learned, without meaning to, the one thing her father never studied, which was the bog itself. Because while he saw a liability, she saw a place that was always doing something. She watched it through the seasons the way another child might watch a fire, often with the old farm collie, a black and white dog named Bess, lying at the firm edge of the ground where the dog had learned not to step. She noticed the way the water sat brown and clear over the black ground, the way the moss built itself up in slow, soft layers, the way the whole acre breathed out a smell after rain that was peat and iron and something older. She did not have a word for what she was learning. She only knew that the dead acre was not dead. It was the most alive ground on the farm, and nobody could see it but her. If you have ever been told that the thing you loved was worthless by someone you trusted, stay with me, because this is a story about being right slowly. It is also a story about what peat actually is, which most people have never been told. Let me tell you about peat, because the whole story turns on it. Peat is what happens when plants die in ground too wet to let them rot. In dry soil, a fallen leaf is eaten by air and bacteria within a season and gone. In a bog, the water seals the air out, the bacteria starve, and the dead moss simply piles up year over year, century over century, pressed down by its own weight into a dense black mass of half-preserved plant matter. A bog grows about 1 millimeter a year. The peat under Catherine's boots that autumn day was 3 meters deep in places, which meant the bottom of it had begun forming when the Romans were still a rumor in the north. Her father walked across 3,000 years of stored time and called it a dead acre. He was not a stupid man. He simply measured land by what it could grow this year, and by that measure, he was correct. And by every other measure, he was missing the entire point. The thing about peat that mattered to the rest of this story is what it does to water and to smoke. Cut and dried, peat burns slow and cool and throws a heavy, aromatic reek, oily and earthy and medicinal, all at once. For 2 centuries, the distillers of Scotland had used that smoke to dry their malted barley, and the smoke had soaked into the grain, and the grain had carried that flavor into the whiskey. Every peated whiskey on earth tasted of some particular bog. The island whiskies tasted of their sea-salted island peat. The mainland whiskies tasted of theirs. The peat was not a fuel. It was a flavor, and the flavor was a fingerprint of one exact place, and no 2 bogs on earth carried the same one. Catherine did not know any of this in 1974. She would spend the next 20 years finding it out. She left the farm at 18, as bright children from small farms often did, and went to the city to make something legible of herself. She trained as an analytical chemist and took work in a laboratory in Glasgow that tested water for the council, measuring what was dissolved in the rivers and reservoirs that fed the taps. It was patient work, exact and unglamorous, and it suited her. She spent 11 years learning to read what water carried, the iron and the acids and the long molecules that leached out of organic ground. She did not know she was training for the dead acre. She thought she had left it behind. Her father grew old on the farm without her. The arable held, the flock shrank, and the bog sat there, being useless in exactly the way he had always said. When he died in the winter of 1991, Catherine came home for the funeral and found the farm smaller and quieter than she remembered, the book still kept in his careful hand right up to the last month, and at the bottom of the last page, a line of arithmetic showing the farm had cleared. She was 26. The neighbors came to the kitchen after the burial and ate the cold ham and spoke about her father the way the glen spoke about its dead, which was honestly, with the failings folded in among the praise. They said he had been a careful man. They said he had held the place through hard decades when others sold. One old farmer, leaning on the dresser with a cup going cold in his hand, said that Hugh Brodie had farmed every acre that could be farmed and let the rest lie, and that there was no shame in a man knowing the difference. Catherine said nothing. She knew her father had not known the difference at all. She walked out after they had gone in her city coat down the track to the bottom of the farm and stood at the edge of the bog while the light went. She felt the ground take the heat from her boots the way wet ground does, and something in her that had been quiet for 18 years woke up and would not go back to sleep. Let me tell you what she did, because it was not sudden and it was not romantic. She did not quit her job and move home to chase a feeling. She kept the lab post for 3 more years and came back to Tullibody every second weekend, and she began, quietly, to test her father's dead acre the way she tested the council's reservoirs. She cut small cores of the peat and brought them to the lab and ran them through her instruments after hours. She measured the water that drained off the bog. And what she found, slowly, across those 3 years was that the dead acre was not ordinary ground at all. The bog sat over a seam of old red sandstone shot through with iron, and the water that moved through it picked up that iron and a particular set of long acidic molecules, the kind that came only from sphagnum moss grown over that exact mineral floor. The peat itself, when she had a sample of it burned and analyzed at a lab in Aberdeen that did such work for the whiskey trade, carried a smoke chemistry, unlike the island peats and unlike the other mainland bogs. It was lower in one class of compound that gave island whiskey its sharp medicinal bite, and higher in another that read, to the people who could read such things as sweet, earthy, almost like dark fruit, and old leather. And by, there was no whiskey in the world that tasted of this bog, because no one had ever thought to make one. Her father had walked across a flavor that did not exist anywhere else and called it a dead acre. She came home for good in the spring of 1994 at 29, and the Glen decided she had lost her sense. A woman with a good city job and a chemist's training come back to farm 400 sodden acres her father had barely held. Her cousin Donald, who farmed the next place over and had always been kind to her, sat in her kitchen and told her plainly she was making a mistake. He was not unkind about it. He simply believed what everyone believed. Let me tell you about Donald, because his path runs alongside Catherine's for the whole of this story, and you should not lose sight of him. Donald Mackey farmed 300 acres of good dry ground above the river, and in the early 90s he did exactly what every farm advisor and bank manager in the country was telling men like him to do. He specialized. He tore out his mixed cropping and his small herd, and he put everything into one thing, a single high-yielding variety of malting barley grown on contract for a big maltster, financed on borrowed money against the promise of a steady price. He bought a new combine on credit. He drained and reseeded and sprayed on a schedule a consultant drew up for him for the better part of 15 years. His yields per acre climbed, his fields ran clean and uniform and golden, and when he stood at the edge of one of them in August, it looked like the future, and Catherine's wet, diverse mess of a farm looked like the past. She did not argue with him. She almost never argued with anyone. She went back to the bog. The first person to put a name to her foolishness in a way that stung was not Donald. It was a man named Ian Forsyth, a development officer from the Regional Enterprise Board, who came out to Tulabadi in the autumn of 1996 because Catherine had applied for a small grant to drain and improve agricultural land, which was the only category her project remotely fit. He was not a bad man, I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to make him the villain, and he was not. He was perhaps 40, university-trained in agricultural economics, sincere and genuinely trying to help her spend public money well. He stood at the edge of the bog in clean boots that had never met mud, and he looked at the black, wet ground, and he looked at her plan, which was not to drain the bog at all, but to cut a little of it, carefully, for fuel, and he could not make the numbers work. He was kind about it, which was worse. He called her project a hobby. He said the word gently, the way you would say it to someone whose feelings you did not want to hurt, and he told her the Enterprise Board could not justify a grant for what was, with respect, a hobby, when the same money could improve real productive acres. He suggested she talk to her cousin Mackie, who was doing things the right way. He left her his card and his good wishes and drove his clean car back down the track, and Catherine stood at the edge of 3,000 years of stored time, holding his card and the word he had used, a hobby. That was the first time the word was said to her face. It would be said twice more before the story was done. Let me tell you what she had actually planned. Because the development officer never understood it. She was not going to farm the bog, she was going to use it. She would cut a small quantity of peat each year by hand, the old way, in narrow banks, that the bog could regrow, drying the turfs through the summer wind. She would build a tiny floor maltings, the kind that had nearly vanished from Scotland, where she would steep her own barley grown on the dry fields above, spread it on a stone floor to germinate, and then dry it over a fire of her own peat. The smoke from her bog would go into her own grain, and that malted, smoked barley she would either sell to a distiller as something no one else on earth could supply, or, if she could ever afford it, turn into whiskey herself. The dead acre was not a field to be improved. It was the one ingredient her farm had that no money could buy and no other farm could copy. She started with the maltings because it was the cheapest piece. Her grandfather's old stone steading had a stone-floored byre with a slate roof, and she cleaned it out and lime-washed it, and laid a kiln floor of perforated tiles she bought second-hand from a maltings being demolished in Fife. Below the floor she built a furnace box where the peat would burn. Above it she would spread the wet, germinating grain so the cool smoke rose up through it. She did the masonry herself with Donald's grudging help, because for all his doubt he would not see a cousin struggle with a wall. Let me tell you about malting, because it is the second mechanism this story turns on, and it is genuinely beautiful. A grain of barley is a seed, and a seed is a packet of starch, wrapped around a sleeping plant, locked shut until the conditions are right. To malt barley, you wake the seed. You steep it in water for 2 or 3 days until it believes spring has come and it begins to germinate. And as it does, it releases enzymes that start to convert its hard starch into soft sugars to feed the sprout it thinks it is about to grow. You let it grow just to the edge of that 4 or 5 days on the floor, turning it by hand so it does not knot together with its own rootlets and overheat. And then, at the exact moment, the starch has been made reachable, but before the sprout has eaten it, you stop the process dead by drying the grain with heat. If you dry it over peat smoke, the smoke condenses into the husk, and the grain carries that flavor forever. The whole craft is a matter of timing and attention, of feeling the warmth and the smell of a living floor of grain with your hands, and it cannot be done from a spreadsheet. It can only be done by someone who is there every few hours, day and night, for a week. Catherine was there. That was the whole of her advantage, and it was an advantage the conventional world could not see, because the conventional world measured labor as a cost, and she was spending it like love. The first malt she made, in the winter of 1997, was a disaster. She dried it too hard and too fast, and the smoke came out acrid and thin. She had stood by the kiln through the night, feeding the peat, anxious to see it work, and she had pushed the fire too high, and the grain had taken the smoke in a hard, sharp note with nothing behind it, like a struck match and no warmth. She spread it on the floor in the morning and smelled it and knew before she tasted it that she had ruined a week of work. She did not waste time being discouraged. She had spent 11 years in a laboratory learning that a failed result is data, and she wrote down what she had done and changed one thing for the next batch, which was the height of the fire. The second was better, the smoke cooler and rounder. By the fourth in 1998, she had a sack of malted barley, smoked over her own bog peat, that smelled when you cupped it in your hands of dark earth and dried fruit and old leather and something clean underneath it like cold water over stone. She took a small bag of it to a distillery on Speyside that bought specialty malt, and the manager there, a busy practical man named Sandy Ross, who had handled malt for 30 years, ran it through his hands and put his nose to it and went quiet. He asked her where it came from. She told him. He had never heard of her bog. He turned the grain over in his palm a second time, the way a man checks something he does not quite believe, and then he bought the whole batch and asked for more, and asked her to come back when she had it. For a few years that was the business. She grew barley on the dry fields, malted it in the old byre over peat from the dead acre, and sold the smoked malt to distillers who could not get that flavor anywhere else. It was not a fortune. It paid the farm's way and a little over, which was more than her father had ever managed, and it let her keep the land. The Enterprise Board never did give her a grant, and Ian Forsyth had moved on to another posting and never knew how his word had landed. Around then, her brother's daughter came into the story, and I want to tell you about her because she is the one who almost talked Catherine out of the whole thing at the worst possible moment. Her name was Hari, Catherine's niece, and in 2006, she finished a degree in food science and a master's in business and came north for a summer to help her aunt and privately to talk sense into her. She also thought Catherine was sitting on a romantic dead end. She had spreadsheets. She had run the numbers on the smoked malt business, and she could show, line by line, that the labor Catherine poured into the hand maltings would never return a proper wage, that the sensible move was to drain the bog after all, plant the whole farm to contract barley like Donald Mackay, and stop playing at a craft that the market would never pay for. She sat at the kitchen table, a telebody, with her laptop open, and she made her case, and it was a good case, and it was the second time the word was used. She did not call it a hobby out of cruelty. She called it that out of love, trying to free her aunt from a trap she thought she could see and her aunt could not. A beautiful hobby, she said. That is costing you your retirement. Catherine listened to all of it. Then she took her niece out to the byre at 2 a.m, when the floor of grain was 3 days into germination, and she put Harry's hand down into the warm living barley and told her to feel it work. The grain was warm with its own life. It smelled of bread and earth. And Harry, who had never touched the thing her spreadsheets described, felt the heat of it come up into her palm and went quiet the way the Speyside manager had gone quiet years before. That was the beginning of her turning, though it took years to complete. She went back south. She kept sending spreadsheets. Yet she had felt the floor, and a part of her never fully argued against it again. Now let me tell you what was happening on Donald Mackay's 300 clean acres, while all this slow, quiet work went on, because the two farms were running toward the same few years from opposite directions. Donald's specialized barley operation looked through the 2000s like the clear winner. His yields were high. His costs per ton were low. His fields were a textbook. He had borrowed more to buy more land and a bigger combine. The consultant's plan was working. And it was working because the weather and the market had stayed for 15 years inside the narrow band the plan assumed. The plan had never been tested by anything outside that band. That is the hidden fragility of the efficient path. It is magnificent, right up until the conditions it depends on stop holding, and then it has nothing in reserve because reserve is the first thing efficiency cuts. The conditions stopped holding in 2012, and then again harder in 2013. Let me tell you about those 2 years because they did the work that no argument of Catherine's ever could have. The summer of 2012 was the wettest in a century across the east of Scotland. Donald's single variety of barley, bred for yield in a normal year, had no defense against a wet one. It lay flat in the fields, the grain sprouting in the ear before it could be cut, and the maltster rejected load after load, because sprouted barley will not malt. He lost most of a crop he had borrowed against. He was not careless. He had done everything the right way, the modern way, the way the whole industry told him was correct. The rain did not care. He might have recovered from one bad year. Then came 2013, which was the opposite and just as cruel, a cold late spring that delayed sowing and a dry summer that stunted the stand, and his yields came in far below the contract assumed. 2 failed harvests in a row against a debt that assumed steady ones. The bank that had been so encouraging grew quiet and then grew formal. By the autumn of 2013, Donald Mackey was facing the loss of the land his family had held for a century, and the consultant who had drawn up the plan did not return his calls. Catherine's farm, those same 2 years, did something that looked from the outside like luck and was not. Her barley was a mix of older varieties, as productive in a good year, but bred or saved over generations for the wet hills, with stiffer straw that did not lie down and a resistance to sprouting the modern variety had lost. In the wet of 2012, her crop yielded modestly and held. In the dry of 2013, her diverse fields, with their deeper soil life from never having been drained and forced, held moisture the clean fields could not. She did not have a triumphant year. Either time she had a steady one. Both times, which, in those 2 years, was the most valuable thing a farm could have. Through both the flood and the drought, a young collie called Moss, named by Catherine for the thing the whole farm depended on, worked the steady fields beside her and slept across the byre door at night while the grain came up on the floor. And the bog, the dead acre, sat there through both the flood and the drought, completely unbothered, because a bog is the one piece of ground that does not care whether the year is wet or dry. It is always wet. It had been always wet for 3,000 years. Which brings us to the whiskey, and to the third time the word was used. By 2010, Catherine had done the thing she had told no one she dreamed of. She had taken her best smoked malt, and instead of selling it, she had it distilled under contract by a small distillery that took in others' malt, made into a clear new spirit, and put into oak casks to age. Whiskey is not whiskey until it has slept in oak for years, and Scotch whiskey cannot legally be called that until it has aged at least 3. She had filled 6 casks in 2010 with spirit made entirely from barley grown on her own fields and smoked over peat from her own bog. Then she had done the hardest thing in the whole craft, which was to wait 6 casks of her own whiskey, sleeping in a bonded warehouse, accruing nothing but time and the slow exchange of flavor between the spirit and the wood, while 2 harvests failed around her and her niece sent spreadsheets and the years passed. In 2013, in the middle of Donald's ruin, a man came to value those casks for insurance purposes, a broker who handled whiskey stock for the trade. He was competent and bored. He had valued 10,000 casks in his career, and they ran together in his mind. He sampled the cask spirit, which was then 3 years old and legally whiskey, but young. And he wrote down a modest figure and, making conversation, asked what she was going to do with it, this odd little parcel of single-farm whiskey from a bog nobody had heard of. He suggested, not unkindly, that she sell it young to a blender who would lose it in a vat, because a farm whiskey with no name and no history was a curiosity. He used the third word without quite saying it. He called the whole thing a nice little hobby that had got out of hand. He meant it as advice. He drove away. He was, like the development officer and like M. Harry, sincere and wrong and not cruel. And he never knew what the parcel he had undervalued would become. Catherine did not sell the casks young. She waited 2 more years. Let me tell you about those 2 years of waiting, because they were the hardest. Donald lost a field, then another, selling land to the bank to stay alive, and Catherine watched a good man broken by good advice, and could not help him without money. She did not have. Marie finished a job in London, and came home for longer stretches, drawn back to the floor she had touched at 2 in the morning years before, and began quietly to learn the maltings herself. And the 6 casks slept, and Catherine did not touch them because she knew the one thing the broker did not, which was what was happening inside the wood. What was happening was that the unusual smoke chemistry of her particular peat, the low medicine and the high sweet earth and dark fruit, was marrying with the oak over years into something no panel of tasters had ever met before. A young peated spirit tastes of smoke, and little else. It takes years in oak for the smoke to settle back, and let the other flavors come forward and integrate, and her smoke was not the island smoke every taster knew. It was its own thing, and it needed time to become legible even to an expert. And time was the one input that could not be rushed or bought, only spent. In the spring of 2015, she judged it ready. And she did the thing she had been building toward for 41 years without always knowing it. She sent a single sample bottle, drawn from her best cask, to a man who could read whiskey the way she could read weather off the hills. His name does not matter to the family the way it matters to the trade. He was the head buyer for a spirits house in Edinburgh that supplied the cellars of the best restaurants in Britain, a man who tasted 400 whiskies a year and had tasted every peated malt of consequence made in his lifetime. He was the qualified judge this whole story had been waiting for, the one person whose verdict could turn a Glen's idea of a foolish woman into something the world would have to take seriously. He tasted it blind, not knowing it came from a single farm, or a bog her father had cursed. Let me tell you what happened in that room because Catherine was not there and heard it, second-hand, and still tells it carefully. He poured a small measure and nosed it, and said nothing for a long time. He tasted it. He set the glass down. And then he asked the question that the trade asks only when something has genuinely surprised them, which was not, how much do you want for it, but where exactly is this from? He had tasted 3,000 years of one particular bog, and he had never met it before, and he wanted to know where on earth it had been hiding. When they told him, it came from a single hill farm in Clackmannanshire, from peat off one wet acre a farmer had called dead, off barley grown on the fields above it, malted by hand by the farmer's daughter. He was quiet again. Then he said, the thing that ended the long argument of Catherine's life. He said it should not be lost in a blend. He said it should be poured by the glass, named for its farm, in the best rooms in the country, and that people would pay for the privilege of tasting a place that existed nowhere else. Then he made an offer for the contents of 1 cask to start, and he did not negotiate. The figure he wrote down for a single oak barrel of whiskey made from a dead acre was more than Hugh Brodie had earned from the whole of Tullibody Mains in the best year of his life, £86,000 for 1 cask. She had 6. She sat with the sheet of paper in the same kitchen where her cousin had told her she was making a mistake, and her niece had called her craft a beautiful hobby costing her retirement, and she did not feel triumphant. She told me years later, sitting at that same table with the rain coming down the window, that what she felt was something closer to grief, because her father had stood on that ground and called it dead and died believing it, and he had been a careful, honest, intelligent man, and he had been wrong about the most valuable thing he ever owned. And there was no way now to show him. She had the proof in her hand, at last a number, a qualified man had written without arguing, and the one person she had spent her life wanting to answer was 24 years in the ground and could not be answered. The vindication she had waited 41 years for arrived into an empty room. She put the sheet of paper in the drawer of the dresser, where her father had kept his careful books, and she went out to the byre, where the floor of grain was 3 days into germination and warm with its own life. And she put her hand down into it the way she always had, and that was how she marked the day. Let me tell you what she did with the money. because it is the truest part of her. She did not scale up. She had every chance to. The Edinburgh house wanted all the whiskey she could make, and would have financed a great expansion, a proper, modern distillery. Contract Peat hauled in to make more of it faster. She said, no. She understood in a way the development officer never had and the broker never had exactly what she was selling, which was scarcity and place and the attention of one pair of hands. The moment she made too much of it, hauled in outside peat, malted by machine, drained the bog to cut faster, it would become ordinary. And ordinary was the one thing it could never be again. The dead acre grew a millimeter a year. She would take from it only what it could replace: narrow banks, cut by hand and left to heal, and the whiskey would always be rare, because the bog would always be small. She had spent her life learning that the value was in the limit. She was not about to spend the limit for money. She used the first cask money to buy back, from the bank, the 2 fields Donald Mackay had lost. Then she did a thing the Glen still talks about. She did not keep them. She rented them back to Donald at a rate he could pay from a single steady harvest on a long lease, and she told him plainly that she did not want his clean, uniform barley. She wanted him to grow on those fields the old mixed varieties her farm had kept, and to malt some of it himself in a second-floor maltings. She would help him build. Over peat she would sell him from the dead acre at a fair price. The proud, broken man who had once sat in her kitchen and called her venture a mistake came back to learn the craft he had spent his life being taught to despise. He was not humiliated. He was taught. By 2018, there were 2 single farm whiskies coming out of that one small glen, and a 3rd farm had started asking questions. Mamhari took over the maltings. She had come north to talk her aunt out of it, and she stayed to inherit it. The spreadsheets folded away into a drawer, her hands on the floor at 2 in the morning, the way her aunt's had been, the way no instrument she had ever trusted could measure. Catherine taught her the bog first, before the malting, because the bog was the thing, and the malting only served it. She walked her niece out to the dead acre and showed her how to read the moss and where the iron ran and how deep to cut and how little to take, and she gave her the one rule her own father had never understood, which was that the ground was not a resource to be spent, but a partner to be kept. Ian Forsyth, the development officer who had called it a hobby in 1996, read about the whiskey in a trade paper around 2019, by then near retirement himself. The story does not record that he ever apologized because he had no idea his single gentle word had landed the way it did, and there was no reckoning between them. Only the quiet fact that the thing he could not justify funding had become the most valuable agricultural product in the county, which was what 1 cask was worth to someone qualified to know. Here is the thing the whole story is about, and I will say it plainly, and then let it go. There are 2 ways of knowing a piece of land. One is the way of the spreadsheet and the consultant and the development officer, which measures what a place yields this year and prices it against what the same money could do elsewhere. It is a clear-eyed way of knowing, and it is correct about a great many things, and it built the clean golden fields that fed a country. Its one blindness is that it can only value what it already knows how to measure, and it calls everything it cannot measure a hobby. The other way of knowing is slower and narrower and deeper. It comes from standing on one piece of ground through 40 seasons and watching what it actually does, and it sees value the first way is structurally blind to, because that value is not in what the ground yields, but in what the ground is and what only that exact ground can be. Hugh Brodie measured his dead acre the first way, and he was honest and careful and wrong. His daughter learned to measure it the second way and waited 41 years. The flood came, and the drought came, and the uniform, efficient fields that looked like the future lay flat in the rain, while the wet, diverse ground that looked like the past held firm. Because what is rigid breaks under a load, the bog did not care about any of it. It had been turning 3,000 years into a flavor that existed nowhere else, a millimeter at a time, the whole while a careful man walked across it and called it dead. Bit. Catherine Brodie still cuts the peat herself in the years her knees allow it. In narrow banks the bog will heal, off the one wet acre that made everything. Her niece cuts the rest. Bicolli moss, gray now around the muzzle, still walks the track to the bottom of the farm with them, and lies at the firm edge of the black ground where every dog before her learned not to step. There is a glass of it poured tonight, somewhere in a quiet, bright room with white cloth on the tables, by someone who paid more for a measure of it than her father once cleared in a week, and they are tasting without knowing it. A hillside in Clackmannanshire and 3,000 years of patient water and the stubbornness of a woman who would not believe the ground she loved was dead. The dead acre was the richest ground the family ever owned. It just kept its wealth in a currency her father never learned to count.